He was born in Amsterdam a month before Liberation Day, former Dutch ambassador in Iraq, in Turkey, in Egypt, in Indonesia, and also an author. He studied Arabic and political and social sciences at the University of Amsterdam, where he obtained a degree of Doctor in Literature in 1977. He studied Arabic and political and social sciences. With former Minister for Foreign Affairs Ben Bot, he achieved a large improvement in the relationship between Indonesia and the Netherlands. We should not interpret freedom of expression as a license to insult other people at will. Everyone has the responsibility to show respect for the rights and reputations of others. Our keynote speaker, Mr. Nikolaos.
Morning, ladies and gentlemen. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Salam sejahtera bagi kita semua. Günaydın. First, I want to thank the previous speaker for introducing the day, and Mr. Permas. I learned again some proverbs which are very important, certainly. Just imagine that you would say the wrong thing, jauh dari hati, dekat dari mata. It would sound strange in Indonesian. Mr. Omar Hadi, Chargé d'Affaires of the Republic of Indonesia, here in The Hague. I'm glad to see some former, well, present friends, but whom I formerly met in Indonesia quite often. Professor Azumardi, Asra, Mrs. Professor Dr. Siti Mustahmulia, Mrs. Nafisa Santur, and our Turkish speakers, Mr. Orhan Hikmet Azizolu and Professor Dr. Bunyamin Duran. It's an honor to be invited today. Ladies and gentlemen, I've been following developments in the Islamic and Arab world for almost half a century now, and for most of that time I never felt bothered by the question of whether or not Islam was compatible with democracy. To me, it was not really a theme which I consider to be relevant. On the contrary, I considered it to be a kind of non-issue, and to a certain extent I still do, except for the fact that many people, particularly in the West, have in the meantime started to consider it to be of essential importance. Therefore, it has become a controversial issue, a controversial question which can no longer be fully ignored. Not that it is a realistic one based on actual facts. It tells me more about the attitude of those who imagine Islam and democracy to be incompatible than about the realities in the Islamic world. If others think that Islam and democracy are incompatible, then I think it should be up to them to prove that this is really the case. What actually happens, however, is that this, in my opinion, wrong presumption is taken for granted by many as an established fact, thereby putting the task on others to prove that it's incorrect, that it is incorrect and unfounded. If people, for instance in the West, argue that Islam and democracy are incompatible, wouldn't it then be their task to also prove that this is the case? What if I say, for instance, that during the 20th century, 3 of the most malicious dictatorships emanated from within Europe? That is, in Nazi Germany under Hitler, in fascist Italy under Mussolini, and in Falangist Spain under General Franco. And if I add to this that these countries all have an overwhelming Christian majority, and that this majority was quite religious, certainly also in the period in which these dictatorships prevailed there, does this mean that Christianity and democracy are actually incompatible? If I would make such a statement, I would almost certainly be ridiculed, because it will rightly be considered as nonsense. After all, most of Europe is now democratic, and the big majority is still Christian. That should be proof enough in itself, wouldn't it? We would not need to study the Bible or other Christian texts to convince us of the thesis that democracy and Christianity are compatible. And if we follow the same logic, we do not have to study the Quran or other Islamic texts to convince us of the fact that Islam and democracy go well together, as is illustrated by countries with a Muslim majority which have democracies, like for instance Indonesia with over 200 million Muslims, Pakistan with about 175 million Muslims, Bangladesh 145 million, Turkey and Nigeria both about 78 million, or a democracy with a very sizable Muslim population like India, which with its 161 million Muslim inhabitants actually is the third largest country in the world as to the number of Muslim inhabitants after Indonesia and Pakistan. To put it differently, there are various Islamic countries with a democratic political system, just as there are various Muslim countries which have a dictatorship. The same applies to non-Muslim countries. Some are democracies, others are dictatorships, irrespective of the religions prevalent amongst its rulers or people. To me, this just indicates that Islam and democracy can go very well together, just as the opposite may be the case. And the same applies to countries with people having another religion, such as Christianity. Therefore, one might draw as a main conclusion that in practice there is no specific link here with either democracy or dictatorship. Having said this, I could end my introduction here, as my main point has actually been made. But I want to make some additional observations. To take a different related question, is the Christian West, if we can call it Christian, and I use the terminology West, which is also of course not very precise, but everyone knows what I mean. Is the Christian West democratic when it comes to Islam? We have seen various examples where Western countries have called, for instance, upon the Palestinians to have free and democratic elections. And the argument was that after free and democratic elections, peace would be more easy and so on. But when the result was a victory of the Islamic resistance organization Hamas, Western countries boycotted the results and generally refused contacts with the new Hamas local government. Something similar happened with the Islamic Salvation Front, FIS, in Algeria, when it won the elections there. Their victory was rejected by the Algerian military, and this rejection was generally supported in the West. The rise of Islamic fundamentalist parties in Iraq, following the American invasion there, was not liked either. The recent election victory of Islamist forces in Tunisia may provide yet another proof to the thesis that democracy and Islam are compatible also in the Arab world. By the way, we have also in the past seen democracies in the Arab world, in Syria, for instance, or in Lebanon. Many people in the West may have to change their position on this issue. The democratic elections in Tunisia last month constitute one of the few successes thus far of the so-called Arab Spring